The loudest sound in West Africa today is not the crackle of gunfire, nor the roar of political rallies. It is the chorus of school children, laughing, singing, and shouting their love for a nation the world once overlooked. In Burkina Faso, a country long cast into the shadows of Western headlines, something extraordinary is unfolding, not in the corridors of power, but in the hearts of the young. A decree, simple in words, seismic in impact, has turned education into an act of devotion, patriotic immersion, a national rite of passage that demands more than knowledge. It demands love for the soil beneath one's feet. And the question we must all ask is this: are we witnessing the first chapter of a new Africa? One where identity is forged not in colonial classrooms, but in the fires of sovereignty? Do not scroll away. What you're about to see is more than a story. It's a reckoning with power, pride, and the African spirit. Subscribe and stay with us. This is not just Burkina Faso's moment. It could be all of ours. It began with a stroke of a pen, but the ink carried the weight of centuries. In early 2024, Captain Ibrahim Traoré signed a decree unlike anything seen before in Africa's modern history. It wasn't a trade deal or a security pact. It was a declaration that Burkina Faso would raise a generation differently. One student, one classroom, one nation at a time. The law mandated that every student who passed a national exam, be it the high school certificate, vocational training diploma, or professional qualification, must complete a stage of patriotic immersion before advancing to higher education. This wasn't a gesture. It was law. Non-negotiable, unavoidable. For generations, education in Burkina Faso followed a path designed elsewhere, modeled after colonial frameworks, geared toward exportable success, detached from national memory. But now that path has been broken. In its place stands a new road, paved not just with curriculum, but with character. The decree's core rests on three pillars. First, physical training. Students are required to undergo structured physical exercises and health education. This is not merely about fitness, it is about fortitude. The aim is to build resilience, discipline, and the mental strength to face both personal and national challenges. Second, civic instruction. No longer treated as ceremonial fluff, civic education becomes central. Students learn their rights, and more importantly, their responsibilities. They are taught the value of law, the duty to vote, the danger of corruption, and the meaning of community. Here, citizenship is no longer passive. It is active, intentional, and proud. Third, patriotic education. Not propaganda, but memory. Young people are introduced to the story of their land, its empires, its resistance, its pain, and its victories. They learn the names of the men and women who bled for independence. They study the moments when their people stood alone and stood tall. The message is clear. To know where you are going, you must know where you came from. Refusal is not permitted. Students who do not attend patriotic immersion will be barred from higher studies and face community service penalties. Even after that penalty is served, the immersion must still be completed unless an exemption is granted directly by the state. To ensure enforcement, the program is not left to a single ministry. It is a collaboration. The Ministry of Secondary Education, Ministry of Defense, Ministry of Security, and Ministry of Higher Education are jointly tasked with implementation. This is not just about reforming schools. It is about redefining the relationship between the citizen and the state. Every student who completes the program receives an official certificate. That document is as vital as a diploma. Without it, there is no entry into university, no place in vocational institutions. It is, quite literally, a passport to the future. Some will see this as a burden, but others, many others, see it as an honor. The decree creates a unifying experience across regions, ethnicities, and classes. Whether a student comes from the urban sprawl of Ouagadougou or a rural village in the Sahel, they will march the same drills, study the same history, and speak the same anthem. In a continent often divided along colonial lines, this program seeks to knit together a generation under one flag. Traoré's decree is a seed, not yet a forest, but the first roots are already deepening. And though the tree may take years to grow, its shadow is already stretching far. But a decree is only ink on paper, until a voice breathes life into it. That voice came not from a minister, but from a child. The turning point did not come in a press release. It came in a playground. In a grainy video captured on a smartphone, a group of school children stood in loose formation, some in crisply ironed uniforms, others in sandals and second-hand shirts. Their voices, however, were anything but fragile. They chanted with conviction, "We will never betray our country. We are loyal to our flag. We have the best president in the world." These were not rehearsed lines. No teleprompters, no microphones, just children, raw, unfiltered, and unwavering. The video spread like wildfire, first on Burkinabè social media, then across West Africa. Within days, it aired on talk shows in Ghana, sparked comment threads in Kenya, and triggered heated debates in Uganda and Cameroon. In every case, the question cut to the bone: can your children say the same? In Ghana, where political allegiance often eclipses national unity, commentators admitted the sobering truth: no classroom of children would declare such loyalty to any current leader. In Uganda and Cameroon, where aged presidents have outlasted generations, the idea that children could love their head of state felt foreign, almost fiction. In Kenya, marred by protests and deep distrust in government, the chants from Burkina Faso sounded like they belonged to another continent. What was it that made these young voices so piercing? Authenticity. They were not echoing adults. They were not enticed by reward or coerced by fear. They were speaking from something deeper, a sense of belonging, of being part of something greater than themselves. This moment, brief, spontaneous, and electric, was the heartbeat of the decree. What had begun as policy now pulsed through the veins of a generation. The law no longer lived only in documents. It lived in the declarations of children. Teachers, once skeptical, found themselves moved. "For the first time," one said, "I see students proud of the flag, not because they were told to be, but because they feel it." Parents who had weathered decades of disillusionment now whispered cautiously about a new kind of hope, not rooted in economics or emigration, but in dignity. And the president himself responded. In a separate address, Ibrahim Traoré spoke directly to the youth. He warned them, "Manipulation is the oldest game in imperialism's playbook. If they control your history, they can control your future," he said. "But if you stand for your flag, no one can make you kneel." It wasn't just a message, it was a manifesto. His tone was not one of conquest, but of protection. "The new Burkina Faso," he said, "needs new patriots. Not in uniform, in spirit." It was a call, not for war, but for awakening. And awaken they did. In Ouagadougou and Bobo Dioulasso, murals began appearing, painted by students, endorsed by local communities. Slogans like, "Loyal to our flag" and "The future belongs to the brave" became emblems of the new era. Hashtags celebrating the reform trended across Francophone Africa. Traoré's name no longer belonged to politics alone. It belonged to poetry, to paint, to the proud fists of 12-year-olds. But the moment that truly crowned this cultural surge was when the children's voices were broadcast alongside Traoré's own, their chants interwoven with his words, a president speaking to his people, a people answering with love. It was not command and obedience, it was resonance. The impact was immediate and irreversible. But outside the borders of Burkina Faso, the children's chants struck a nerve, especially in the halls of Western power. Change rarely arrives in uniforms. Sometimes it enters quietly, through the corridors of classrooms, through the eyes of parents, through the pride of those who once felt forgotten. In the months following the decree, the ripple effects of patriotic immersion began to reshape daily life across Burkina Faso. The reform was not just being implemented, it was being lived. Families were the first to feel the shift. In neighborhoods where conversations once centered on how to send a child abroad, to Paris, to New York, to escape, there emerged a different tone. Parents began to speak not of departure, but of direction. For the first time in decades, they sensed their children might inherit more than survival. They might inherit purpose. One mother in Ouagadougou, whose son had just completed the immersion, put it plainly. "Before, I worried he would leave and forget us. Now he wears the flag like a second skin." The transformation in schools was equally profound. Teachers, long burdened by curricula disconnected from local realities, found renewed meaning in their role. Education was no longer just a conveyor belt toward diplomas. It was a forge for character. Civic lessons, once glossed over, became the core of the classroom. National history, once a footnote, became a living narrative. Principals began to refer to immersion not as a requirement, but as a rite of passage. One director called it a mirror held up to the soul of the student, and that mirror reflected a shared identity, far more powerful than any test score. But for the youth, the change was not just ideological, it was structural and emotional. The pressure was real. Without immersion, there was no advancement, no university, no technical training. The law was strict, and students knew it. Skipping the program invited public penalties, community service, and a stigma that struck deeper than punishment: disloyalty. Yet pride quickly eclipsed pressure. Completing immersion became a badge of honor. Students began referring to themselves as guardians of the nation, bonded not by blood, but by oath. In every town, a quiet fraternity formed. Youth who had stood for their country before standing for themselves. This shared experience crossed lines that had long divided the nation. Ethnic, regional, and political boundaries blurred. A young man from the north and a girl from the west might never have met. But through immersion, they marched together, debated history together, and found that loyalty to the nation transcended all other identities. This is where the decree took on its most radical form. It reordered the hierarchy of allegiance. In much of Africa, loyalty flows first to party, to tribe, to sponsor. In Burkina Faso, Traoré is attempting to reverse that order. The nation comes first, the flag before the faction, the land before the leader. It is a subtle revolution, but a foundational one. In doing so, he is laying groundwork for something far greater than civic reform. He is crafting the cultural core of anti-colonial Africa. A generation harder to buy, harder to divide, and harder to manipulate with the tools once used by foreign powers. The political consequences are immense. In the short term, the decree has strengthened national cohesion. Young people speak less of parties and more of country. Voting behavior is shifting, not by decree, but by conviction. Corruption, once normalized, is increasingly seen as betrayal. Long-term, the implications are even deeper. By connecting education to national loyalty, the state is building a firewall, not just against internal instability, but against external interference, a firewall of identity. But if a generation cannot be bought, it also cannot be controlled. That's what worried the West. From embassies in Ouagadougou to boardrooms in Washington and newsrooms in Paris, the decree did not go unnoticed. In the United States, analysts were divided. On one hand, some praised the focus on civic education, recalling America's own foundations in compulsory civic training during the early republic. They recognized that a generation taught to value service and history might foster stability in a region often plagued by instability. But others were uneasy. If Burkinabè youth are raised to question foreign narratives, to reject the myth of Western benevolence, then America's soft power could erode. A young citizen who knows his nation's heroes, who understands colonial subjugation not from textbooks in English, but from the voice of elders and the ink of African scholars, is a citizen far less likely to be seduced by slogans wrapped in diplomacy. The concern was not abstract. U.S. think tanks began circulating internal memos comparing Burkina Faso's patriotic immersion to China's model of ideological education. The comparison was clear. If African states start teaching their own truth, who will listen to ours? In France, the reaction was sharper and more bitter. French commentators, long accustomed to influence in West Africa, viewed the decree as yet another blow to Paris's cultural foothold. For decades, France maintained its grip not just through military bases or trade, but through the minds of elites educated in French lycées and universities. Now, with patriotic immersion, that influence faces a direct and deliberate challenge. If the youth of Burkina Faso grow up taught to distrust external interference, then the old tools of control, prestige, language, nostalgia, begin to crumble. Across the African continent, the response was mixed, but passionate. In Ghana, editors admitted their school systems had failed to instill genuine patriotism. In Kenya, commentators debated whether such a program could unify a generation fractured by party lines and tribal affiliations. In Uganda and Cameroon, the comparison struck deeper. Would children ever speak of their long-reigning presidents the way Burkinabè youth spoke of Traoré? But amidst the debate, one truth emerged. African sovereignty is no longer a slogan. It is a curriculum. It is law. It is alive in the way a child carries the flag and recites the names of martyrs. If this reform spreads, it could flip the script of who shapes the next Africa. No decree, however bold, is immune to danger, and no generation, however united, is beyond risk. The Patriotic Immersion program stands today as a symbol of national pride, but tomorrow it could be tested. The very power that gives it strength could, in other hands, be used to silence dissent. What begins as civic duty can become enforced conformity. The line between informed patriotism and blind obedience is razor-thin, and history has shown how easily leaders can tip that balance. Inside Burkina Faso, the challenge is already clear: how to preserve the spirit of the program without turning it into dogma, how to teach children to love their country without fearing criticism, how to raise voices without muting questions. Outside the country, pressure is mounting. Western powers, uneasy with the rise of a generation immune to manipulation, may turn to economic levers, media narratives, or diplomatic isolation. Sanctions, soft pressure, and whispers of indoctrination are not just possible, they've already begun. Traoré may have planted a seed of national consciousness, but will the soil be left undisturbed long enough for it to grow? And yet, amidst all of this uncertainty, one thing is undeniable. A new social contract is being written, one where citizens are not customers of the state, but co-authors of its destiny, where a school certificate carries not only academic merit, but moral weight. The reform has shifted the burden of proof from the youth to the state. No longer can leaders claim patriotism while acting against the people, because now the people, especially the young, know what patriotism truly means. Across classrooms and communities, a quiet revolution is taking shape. It doesn't wear uniforms or chant slogans. It grows in how a student lifts their hand in class, how a teacher rewrites their lesson plan, how a parent speaks of the future. This is not just Burkina Faso's path. It may be Africa's new compass. The final exam for this generation won't be on paper. It will be in history. Burkina Faso is no longer just educating its children. It is forging citizens. Through a single decree, Captain Ibrahim Traoré has done more than alter a curriculum. He has shifted the axis of belief. He has reminded a people, especially the young, that knowledge without loyalty is hollow, and patriotism without purpose is dangerous. In classrooms once shaped by colonial frameworks, students now stand not just for lessons, but for legacy. The children's voices, once ignored, now carry the gravity of a nation. Their chants are no longer cute or curious. They are constitutional. Their pride is no longer rare. It is revolutionary. Their presence in this national conversation is no longer symbolic. It is structural. This is anti-colonial Africa, not as protest, but as policy. This is African sovereignty, not as sentiment, but as standard. Yes, there are risks. Yes, there are fears. But what nation ever rose without first daring to define itself? In a time when many countries struggle to unite even their leaders, Burkina Faso is uniting its children. That in itself is a victory. The challenge now is to guard the spirit of the reform, to ensure it remains a fire that warms, not one that scorches, to ensure the flag is lifted not out of fear, but out of love. Because if this model holds, it may not remain Burkinabè for long. It may become continental. If you believe that Africa's future is not written in foreign offices, but in the classrooms of Ouagadougou, then this is your moment to share, to speak, and to stand. Subscribe and help keep this forest of pride growing.